welcome to Troublesome Terps, the least fit podcast you've ever heard.
I think we'll help a lot of people with that.
Mr. Downey, your problem is your job.
I almost interpreted him once, which was one of the most nerve-wracking situations in my life, and then it turns out he didn't make the flight and wasn't at the conference. So a lot of anxiety over nothing.
That's a bit like going to confession to the Pope, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The last I checked, you were a human being with free will and an internet connection.
Take one. Action. Welcome to Troublesome Terps, the Pros Community Choice Award nominated podcast that answers the question, do interpreters ever stop talking? So with me today is a man whose contributions to interpreting include consecutive Glaswegian in a bingo hall and introducing the profession to deep-fried Mars bars, Dr. Jonathan Downey.
Thank you very much. I'm not actually eating deep-fried Mars bar at the moment because I do care about my health.
That's a very wise decision. Then today, as a very special guest, we have Ewandro Magalhaes joining us, who is the former chief interpreter for the International Telecommunications Union, a senior UN interpreter, and now the brains behind the very first TED Ad video for interpreting, with now more than 360,000 views on YouTube. Welcome, Ewandro.
Well, thank you very much. Can I ask you to do that again? I'll go in and ask my mother to come and watch this.
I think she'd love it.
Really flattered. Thank you very much for this very generous introduction.
And also with us today is a man who puts the institution in European institutions, Alexander Drexel. Also, Alex, I was informed that there's a Lang FM podcast episode with you and Ewandro. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct, yes. And I'll put the link into the show notes. So if you're more interested in all kinds of biographical information and what Ewandro did before he became a very successful UN interpreter and chief interpreter, you should absolutely listen to that episode.
Perfect. I think we'll also link to the video in the description. So if you guys want to check that out, the link is right there. So today's subject, or the subject of today's podcast, I should say, is one near and dear to all of our hearts, I believe, because in a world where we are mistaken for translators, trapped in glass boxes like mimes, and made invisible in the media, it really does matter what people think of our work and how they perceive it, if they perceive it consciously at all. So maybe we could kick things off by having Ewandro chime in, because you've just created this fantastic TED video, as we've mentioned, with hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube. And tell us a little bit about why you decided to make such a video and what the response to it has been.
Well, the response has been overwhelming. I mean, considering that none I've ever written got this kind of response. 360,000 people, and it's been out for maybe a month and a half, 2 months. So we're on our way to maybe 500,000 people watching it in the next 2 months or so. So it's my most successful piece of writing to date. So I'm very proud of it in a way, but also very happy to see that it did indeed change the perception people have of the profession and of what we do. If you go over the 800 comments or so that you see on the YouTube channel from TED Ads specifically, you will see that many people have walked away from the piece with a much greater respect, if you will, for the profession and for interpreters. They say things like, "Wow, I never thought it was so much work. I never realized they put so much effort into it," and so on. So I think it did a good job of, broadening the overall awareness about what we do. Now, the reason, how I came about to do it or why I did it was just that I'm a big fan of TED. I like to watch the TED Talks, and I also like the TED lessons particularly. I find them very interesting. So one day I looked all over the place for anything regarding interpretation. I couldn't find it. So I decided to go online, nominate myself as an educator, and pitch an idea to them. And that's how it started. They liked it. They contacted me a few days later. We discussed it online over a few Skype interviews. And before I knew, I was already writing the script. So this is how it works.
So what was the timeline? How long did the whole thing take, more or less?
That's a good question. They tell you it takes about 4 months. In my case, it took about 6 because I was traveling a lot also, and they also had some other things that they needed to attend to. Also, they do a very thorough job of checking every piece of information. For example, the piece opens with the 1956 diplomatic reception in Moscow, where Khrushchev was supposed, is quoted to have said, the famous, "We will bury you."
Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev told Western Bloc ambassadors, "Мы вас похороним." His interpreter rendered that into English as, "We will bury you." This statement sent shockwaves through the Western world.
And in my mind, it was a phrase that he had said at the UN in New York, in the wake of that same episode where he was, banging his shoe on the table and so on. And I was wrong about that. So they have a team of fact checkers, as they call them, to actually check every piece of information for you. So they do a very good job of making sure every piece of information is out there as correctly as it could possibly be.
So you mentioned that you read the comments, which I'm sure everybody knows is not something that you should do, but I think in your instance, it really came out well. And I think what your video did so fantastically is really describe in a very understandable and kind of tangible way what we do, because I think that's really what interpreters struggle with, what our profession struggles with, is that people don't really understand what we do. If you say you're a translator, somehow everybody kind of has a rough understanding. But then if you say you're an interpreter, people think you're a translator and that they have a rough understanding of what you do, and then they don't. So I think your video did a beautiful job really illustrating that in a very funny way. So I think that was really, fantastic. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I must say that half of the credit should go to the designers, the animators and so on, because you write the script and then they critique it. And there are many things in the script that they ask you to remove or change in such a way as to make their job of animating it easier. So on many occasions, I wanted to say something one way, and they said, no, this is too much detail. We'll take care of it in the animation. The whole alien concept, the whole story behind it, how they pictured it. I mean, this was entirely their decision. So I never thought, well, why don't we use an alien and this analogy and that? So they're very, very resourceful in that regard. The risk when you do something like this, for us interpreters, is that because there's so much criticism out there, and because interpreters are so opinionated, when we think about doing something like that, we immediately think about the interpreters and we start talking to them instead. So I came into it with a very firm decision not to do it for interpreters. I reminded myself over and over that I was talking to the public at large, to students mostly, high schoolers, people who want to have a broader understanding of what interpreting is, and maybe to a point that they get fascinated enough about it and they want to move into the profession. So that was the overall purpose behind it. Because if you think too much about the interpreter, then, of course, there will be people who think, that shadowing is not established, teaching method, and they will criticize something else and so on. And it's important that they understand that this is a piece for the overall public, and I had that very clear in my mind from the get-go.
One of the things that struck me about the video, especially in the context of other changes that we're seeing in the way that professionals are talking about their own work, is that it managed to show people that our job is not just a case of saying what the person said. There's actually occasions in there where you see interpreters making real-life decisions that have an impact, and I think that's part of what the conversation I think that the video is opening now in the public eye and even amongst interpreters, is the fact that we're not these kind of language machines who just turn up, plug in, say what the person said and go home. I think to be able to open people up to the fact that we're making real decisions that actually have an effect.
Absolutely.
And I think if we can get interpreters to understand that they're not language machines, I think that's a huge step forward for the profession. And I think when we get people looking at doing jobs, understanding what it is that we do and what it is we don't do, that's going to attract far more people than this view of, we never make any decisions, we just say what the person said.
And to that end, it's interesting to note that the video opens with a mistake.
Yes.
An occurrence where the interpreter made, quote unquote, a mistake. Of course, the interpreter in question went to his grave sustaining that he never made a mistake, that was exactly the intended meaning and so on. But given the circumstances, given everything that was at stake, you could argue that he could have chosen his words differently. So the piece opens with an episode, an example of where things go wrong, and still it shows that fine, this is a best effort kind of thing. We'll try to communicate, we'll try to get it across no matter what. So, in retrospect, because I felt very uncomfortable opening with that mistake episode, and the TED people insisted on that because they said this will create the right hook, and it did. So I have to acknowledge that.
What I really like is the fact that finally we have something good about interpreters on YouTube, because I guess if you just search for interpreter on YouTube, you find all kinds of bloopers and, strange things, like the guy who interpreted, and I'm using air quotes here, at the Nelson Mandela ceremony and that kind of stuff, or, comedy clips and so on and so forth. So I think it's very good to have something up there on YouTube that is really right, that represents the profession correctly, and just puts out the facts, as it were.
Yeah, and I hope more videos will come in the wake of that one. So because now it's a subject that is out there already on TED. So it's easier for anybody, any of you now, to pitch a subsequent idea to them and say, hey, by the way, as a follow-up to that video and so on, maybe perhaps you could talk about this and another aspect like that and so on, which is what I'm trying to do now. I mean, they just cleared a second episode. It is not specifically about interpreting. It talks about the circumnavigation of the world, the Magellan trip. But I wanted to, again, talk about it from the point of view of the very first man who actually went full circle, which was not Magellan, but rather his interpreter. A slave that he acquired on a first trip to Malacca, brought him to Spain and Portugal, and by the time they reached the Spice Islands again, that guy was back home. Now, because it's sort of controversial and so on, TED doesn't really want to go there, so they now rely on me to write a good enough script that will emphasize some of those aspects. But what they want me now is to tell the story of the journey, the expedition, which limits me in a certain way, but still gives me the possibility of, if I can do it wisely enough, to talk about one specific aspect of that journey, which is the language aspect. Relying on someone who is probably from that part of the world, and betting that once we're back there, that guy will be able to communicate somehow with whomever it is that we find. And that worked. Not only that, they also, because of a number of circumstances, when Magellan eventually died and the interpreter chose not to continue the trip, the person, the interpreter, the ad hoc interpreter who made it possible for them to get out of that maze and reach Spain back, was someone who had spent hours and hours on the ship with a slave, putting together a glossary and a dictionary. So that was what eventually saved everybody's fate.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is that in most professions, especially if you come across, say, scientists, or you come across teachers or nurses or doctors, there are people who are held up in the profession as these are professional heroes who, they may be 200 years old, but, people know about Florence Nightingale, people know about heroes of other professions. What we don't have in interpreting, really, that we've talked to the world about, is the mentality of here are people who have really made such a massive difference to the way we interpret. I was reading recently about one of the interpreters at the Nuremberg war trials was himself a German Jew. Mm-hmm. When you understand the background that some of the first professional interpreters came from, when you understand the impact that interpreters have had in things like the opening up of the west of the USA was reliant on interpreters. There's a real case that we should be making that the world as we know it now has been and is reliant on the work of interpreters to function. And if every other profession is able to say the same thing, it's about time that interpreters made that exact same case too.
Absolutely, and I think you can't really point to any historic episode, an episode of historic proportions, where an interpreter was not there. I mean, in the age of discoveries all over the place and so on, and if you extrapolate from there, even the Voyager, the space probes, who are now beyond the solar system and God knows where, they carry a lot of information about our planet, about our galaxy, and so on, coded in all different languages of the world, in different schematic arrangements, and so on. Let's suppose that this thing, drops, falls on an asteroid or I don't know, a planet or whatever. If a given day somebody breaks that code, in a way, that will be an alien interpreter. I mean, whoever does it will be an interpreter. I mean, we'll have to credit that person for that discovery somehow. So, I mean, it takes this kind of genius, if you will. And very few professions, yes, I agree with you, can claim that, yeah.
But I think the interesting question is why the professions of interpreter and translator are misrepresented, or why people have such strange ideas about those professions, or why people think, well, anybody who spent 2 weeks in Spain can do that. And I really wonder where that comes from. I mean, one reason certainly is that, of course, the media really enjoy talking about interpreter mistakes, especially when it's high stakes, when it's very visible, very public. But I mean, that can't be all.
You guys know that I'm not one for controversy. I never say anything controversial. But from my studies, one of the things that I discovered during the PhD, which shocked me, is that there have been studies of what interpreters have said to the public. And all of the studies that have done this have discovered that the impression that interpreters have voluntarily given to the public is that we are language machines, basically. And that we just say what the speaker said and that we don't really make any decisions. We're still saying what the speaker said, but just in a different way. And there's a suggestion, certainly in my PhD thesis, and I've seen it in other work as well, that if you give people the impression that you're a language machine, you tend to create an environment where people say, well, you're replaceable. If, on the other hand, like many other professions, you start talking up the difficulty of what you do, you talk up the humanity of what you do, you talk up the difficult decision-making and the fact that for interpreting to work, we need the cooperation of the speakers and the audience, otherwise it falls over, then suddenly respect comes. And I wonder whether, in some senses, without meaning to, in all of our efforts to appear professional and trustworthy and so on, we've given people a false impression of the nature of our work. And it's why Ewandro's video is so powerful, because it corrects some of the false impressions that have gone out, even from professionals who have been trying their hardest to do a good job of representing the profession. But we needed something like that to correct this view that we're language machines.
Good point, yeah.
Yeah, I tend to agree, Jonathan. And in most of my writing, I tried to revisit some of those points. But I also look at it from a different angle, which is many interpreters, especially when I was starting out, and I was fascinated by the profession, and I would approach a professional interpreter and so on, they very often would dismiss me. And when I asked me, how is this possible? How do you do it? And so on, they didn't quite provide any explanation, rather than saying that, well, it's a gift, and I don't know how I do it. I just do. It's not everyone, but some of us can do it, and so on. They perpetuated that idea that this is a gift. This is something that is quite closed and nobody can crack this nut open, maybe for fear of being exposed and maybe for fear of eventually revealing that this is a trainable skill like any other. So for many, many years, I guess, that contributed to that notion of interpreting being, a very exclusive club, a very closed profession, and something that you have to be born into.
So, Jonathan and Alex, do you think this video could also be helpful in your relations with clients, potential clients, existing clients? Do you think you could point them to that video? Probably more useful for new clients or future clients. Do you think that could be something that you could use for marketing as well?
I think so, because, well, it depends. I think it's mostly very useful for new clients, because clients who are repeat clients, they've already worked with you. So hopefully you will have given them some sort of an understanding as to what's going on. But I think for new clients, it gives them a very quick and easy way into our profession to understand what's going on. I don't know how I would get them to watch the video, because, oftentimes you're struggling to have your clients read a lengthy email. So I don't know if I would get them to watch a YouTube video. Of course, I'm going to try, because I think it's great. But I think every single tool in the toolbox can help. So in Germany over here, in the German Association of Conference Interpreters, we have these little postcards which we can hand out, which is basically a little infograph diagram sort of thing, which explains different aspects of conference interpreting. And it's very easy. It's very cool. It's kind of like a cartoon style, relatively similar to what the video looks like. And it's just a fun, kind of playful way to give clients a quick overview of what we do and of how they can help. So one of the cards is actually tips for speakers. So I think that's very handy. And I think all of those elements, all of those tools that we have, if we can combine them and we can use them, I think that's going to improve how our clients perceive us, and also how we can communicate with our clients, because it's kind of, I don't want to say we can educate them, but I think we can help them further their understanding.
I think for me the marketing use of it is helpful, although I think at the same time we need to further look at tools to talk to clients about the value that interpreting has for them, the fact that they really shouldn't see interpreting as a cost item. They should see it as an investment item, because if we do our job properly, the returns will be far greater than they spend on us. That's an additional narrative I think we need to be talking to them about. But I think what's more exciting for me is the potential to take this video into secondary schools, even into primary schools, homeschool people, and to show the next generation of possible interpreters, this is how exciting our career is. We've not been very good, certainly before undergraduate level university, at selling the profession to people who could come into it. And I think I watched the video and I thought, there are so many teenagers who would see that and go, wow, I want to be one of them. And I don't know about you, the way that I fell in love with interpreting is I saw people actually interpreting on stage, and within 5 minutes of seeing what they were doing, decided that's the job I want to do. It seems to be one of these jobs that until you see it working, you don't even know it exists. And I think, it's going to be a good client awareness thing, but I think for it to work, we need to start changing our narrative around interpreting, and I think that is a massive challenge, and where we need interpreter education to go alongside what we would call client education, which is a misnomer anyway.
Jonathan, that's interesting. Again, if you go over the comments, and I did, I answered to all of the respectful comments that were out there. And of course, if it was just a troll, I would ignore it. But if you go over the comments, it's very interesting, because you do get a number of people saying, wow, this is so interesting, my dream job. I didn't know this was so exciting. And several of them actually reached out to me. I'm indeed mentoring a few, 2 or 3, just trying to steer them in the right direction. But also you see people saying things like, hell, I'm happy this is not me. Wow, this is so stressful. Thank God I don't have to do that job. You see? So again, it gives that kind of thrill to those who already have a seed somewhere there. They love the language aspect of it or whatever, but you get both reactions. It's very interesting.
That reminds me of I was at a week seminar in Italy, and it was church interpreters and Bible translators together, and we wanted the Bible translators to understand what it is that interpreters do, so we just gave them some very basic interpreter training exercises, the kind of things that most universities do on the first day. We used shadowing, as well. And it surprised me that you had highly experienced Bible translators, some of whom had learned multiple languages, one of whom had become an expert in taking written texts and working with people to turn them into dances and drum songs and whatever. And the number one comment back from just doing basic, not even bilingual, but monolingual exercises was, I'm glad I'm a translator, that's really difficult. And I thought, after you've done interpreting for a while, you get stunned when people say that's a really difficult job, because you say, it's so fun I forget sometimes.
Yeah, I get that a lot too.
We have to realise that there are several ways to teach interpreting, there are several ways to learn interpreting, there are several routes into the profession, and I think that the more we get used to the fact that interpreting is such a varied beast, and what works for some people may not work for others. There are some things that seem to work across the board, but there are some tools that some people use more effectively than others, and I think we just have to get used to the variety of our job, and maybe someone should do a TED Ed video on the sheer variety of where interpreters can work, just to show people that you don't have to be in a pristine conference hall in Geneva. You could be, in my case, in a muddy field outside of an ex-industrial town in the west of Scotland, or you could have someone else in a hospital or wherever. The sheer variety, I think, makes interpreting amazing in itself.
Yet you don't lack the training wheels, huh?
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about, right? The article you wrote about no, don't try this at home. Just don't go into a booth and let's see how it works. So if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
The training wheels article was because for the first time ever I've disagreed with one of the people who I lean on for marketing advice. And I might elaborate on that a little bit and kind of talk about the fact that sometimes we blame the tools for what is the fault of the people. And I think that's a big issue. So I hear people saying things like, they didn't train me in marketing skills at university. And it's like, well, it's not saying that we shouldn't teach skills at university, but the more into my career I go, the more I realise that I have to take responsibility for my own lack of knowledge in places. And I think if universities can teach anything, and if we could teach interpreters anything, it would be take responsibility for your own career as early as possible. And if things are going wrong, don't run away, find a way to fix it. It's what we do in the booth every day. If you're having a tough shift, you don't, slam the microphone down and run out the booth and never come back. You find a way to fix it.
So we've talked a little bit about what can be done to improve, I guess, the reputation of our profession, and it's individual work for each and every one of us, I think. Alexander talked a little bit about what professional associations are doing. Can the associations maybe do more? Can they do other things? Are they doing enough? What's your take on that?
I think they're trying. I think they're really trying, which is not necessarily a satisfactory answer. But I think a good example is this really nice poster initiative that the Bavarian chapter of the Federal Association of Interpreters and Translators did here in Germany, in Bavaria. They have these really well-designed posters, one showing an interpreter, a lady in, I believe, the European Union or United Nations Assembly Hall, and one showing a translator sitting at home on the computer with dictionaries. It's a little cliche, but it really gets the point across. It really gets the message across. And they've plastered those posters around big cities in Bavaria. And I think it's obviously very costly, which you can't do that all the time. But I think that kind of pushes us into the consciousness of the general public, because let's face it, if you're not attending international conferences or congresses, if you're not sitting in on these European Works Councils, if you're not a delegate at the European Union or the United Nations, chances are you will probably have rarely ever heard of us or what we do. So I think a big chance, but also a big challenge, is how we get into the public consciousness, because most people know, translators. And I think Ewandro and Jonathan, you guys were talking about how varied our field is, and it's not just the pristine halls of conference interpreting, but I think that's part of the challenge, because with translation, and I'm probably going to get crucified for this, but translation is kind of what it is. There's always some form of typing on a computer and you're relaying one text into another language. With interpreting, you're sitting at a hospital bed, you're delivering, devastating diagnosis, but then also you're enabling million dollar business deals and conferences, I don't know, somewhere in the middle of London. So there's all these various aspects which I think make it very hard to communicate what it is that we do exactly. And I think that's where we're all struggling with. And I think that's kind of what the professional associations try to do. But again, it's very difficult to communicate clearly and effectively the individual facets of interpreting without losing focus and losing the interest of the public, because it gets too complicated and muddled, but also doing the job justice. So I think that's a very interesting field of tension that we're in here.
Ewandro, I wanted to come back to one aspect of interpreting, which is interpreting in the institutions. And I was wondering if maybe at the ITU or in the UN system in general, whether you have done any awareness raising campaigns for your clients, i.e. for the delegates, for the people you work for. Have you done any awareness raising for them, trying to show the value of interpreting and the value of multilingualism in general?
I do a lot of selling internally, not to delegates, but to staff. Because my take on it is that if I can convince my colleagues about why it is that we have certain rules and why they are important, and tell them why, how it is that we work, the shifts and the rotation and the takes that, the turns that we take, if I can make them aware of that, then they will be more respectful, time-wise, and with all the procedures and so on, and they will communicate that effectively to the delegates. So every semester I hold at least one public session where everybody in ITU is invited, anyone in any way connected to event management, and we go for a 2-hour presentation, which used to be pretty much the video that I eventually posted on YouTube. The other one, the one Alex just mentioned today on LinkedIn, and by the way, thank you. And it's that presentation telling them exactly the mechanics and all the IAIC rules that pertain to the UN. And that has a very interesting ripple effect. Every time we do it, the number of complaints and the number of overruns and so on tend to diminish.
Yeah, we have a similar initiative actually in the commission. I have a very good, very active Spanish colleague who gives actual real workshops to other colleagues from the commission. So those, so similar to what you said, those who organize conferences, those who need interpreting for their meetings or for their conferences. And what he does as well is he puts them into the booth and he lets them interpret. And he also shows them the difference between a good speaker and a bad speaker. So he has 2 scenarios, one where he really makes an effort of trying to communicate, of enunciating properly and so on and so forth. And the other scenarios where he just rambles on without sense and purpose and just goes very quickly and then makes people realize what a huge difference that can make. And that's always very revealing. But of course, the downside is that you can only reach so many people by doing that, especially in these huge institutions. It's difficult to have really a big reach. And I think it's similar on the private market where you don't really know who your customer is or could be. I think it's very difficult to really address the right people necessarily.
But that person will leave the booth talking to several others. So the experience is really impactful.
Yeah.
So that will be a ripple effect there as well.
I think that's the interesting thing, is that with tools like the TED Ed video, which is going to make such a big difference if we use it well, but also with one of the most useful tools that I found is I decided that I wanted to get into my clients' world. Especially my potential clients. I'm trying to get to talk to the big event management agencies and even the smaller ones as well. And so I've started going to their trade shows. And the last time I'd been there for about 5 minutes, and I got talking to this lady from a large event management agency who as soon as she found out I spoke French, switched the entire conversation into French. And what made her eyes open was the fact that I was there gaining an understanding of what it is they do, the pressures that they're under, and what makes their clients come back to them. So rather than saying, here's a list of rules and regulations using interpreting that you have to follow, the conversation was more about, okay, let's hear what your clients want from you. And it was little things like she was saying, we really wish that we could get to the point where we have the same interpreting team every time, because then they would know how we work, we would know how they work, and we'd be confident with what they're delivering. And I thought little things like that. We don't always need to go into with the clients and wallop them over the head with the manual for an ISO booth, but we can sit there and go, okay, if your meeting is going to be effective, let's have a discussion about what that means. And that gets them on side a whole lot quicker, because you're trying to make their agenda work rather than yours. And you learn a lot more about what's going on in people's heads when they're trying to listen to us or trying to book us. And funnily enough, that particular agency have put me on their preferred supplier list. So the doors open when you ask the questions, and when you think, okay, are there points where we need to be flexible and say, okay, I know we would normally do it this way, but actually in your setting, maybe this other way is slightly better, is slightly more effective. Because the rules don't necessarily work for every single client, for every single event. I know that's controversial, but we have to think about what's going to work for the client rather than what makes us comfortable.
That's a very good point. When I was in a different life where I've had my translation agency for 17 years in Brazil, and I was the chief linguist there. This goes back maybe at least 10 years. I mean, the very end of that. I was in the business of sending, whenever we had like a medical congress and so on, I would go ahead and send, systematically to every speaker that was lined up to speak, a very summarized version of a text that you can also find out there that I wrote on LinkedIn. Tips on how to make your presentation more interpreter friendly, but from that specific point of view, how to use interpreters to your advantage. These are, little things that you can do which will actually increase your impact. It's not to make my life easier. It's to actually make your impact bigger. So, I'm a big fan of information. I think our job is to get as much information out there as possible in many different ways. The video, for example, that we've been discussing, I don't know anybody in IT who doesn't know it, because I've sent it to everyone. I've posted it everywhere in the intranet, on the extranets, and so on. Everybody pretty much has at least had a chance to watch the video, but the information is out there. Do you remember, I'm sure you're familiar with a video called Smart Speaking from Calliope Interpreters. Have you seen that?
Those are very good videos. I've seen them, and I'll put them in the show notes as well, because also the animation is very well done, and it's it's fun. Yeah, it's not so serious.
The animation is fun. It's very interesting. It tells people exactly how to relate to interpreters and so on.
So maybe just throwing it out there as a general point of discussion, but I wonder how, because there are a lot of us out there, if you think about it, a lot of interpreters globally, and if every, 10th one of us just did something along the lines of your video, Ewandro, I think we could really start shifting the conversation, or raise more awareness about, how we can help, what we can do, what can't we do. And I just wonder how we can kind of energize the crowd to get moving.
I think the associations could do more. They should start talking more to people out there and not just to interpreters. What we see within the associations is that they cater too much to their members. And with good reason, I understand that. But it's about time we talk to people out there, people who are beyond the confines of our profession. If we really want to raise awareness, we can't just be talking to interpreters and talking to one another. Right?
Yeah, I was thinking about something similar, because there's this annual day of Saint Jerome, who's the patron saint of translators, and I guess by extension interpreters as well. And there have always been awareness raising events, but I had the impression as well that they're very often intentionally or unintentionally more geared towards the profession and not towards the public. So that's something we can work on, absolutely.
I think we need our own patron saint of interpreting. We need to find someone who's related to interpreting. It's funnily enough, academics are getting very good at it, and that is understanding that the outside world does not owe us anything, and so if we want people to be interested in what we're doing, we're the ones who have to go out and do it. And thinking of one thing that we wish people knew. I'm loving the fact that so many interpreters now are writing about effective speaking or working with interpreters. But I was talking to an events manager recently, and I just threw out an idea. I said, well, I've been writing content for event management agencies on my blog every so often. And so what I suggested, I said, would it be worthwhile for me to collect all the advice I've already got online, add some new stuff, and just create a free small ebook for event management agencies on effectively searching for, hiring, managing, and working with interpreters? And the response was, yes, and can I have the first copy? But most of the advice that I'm giving, if you read my blog, if you read LinkedIn Pulse, if you read the advice that any of us are giving, what we're saying are the kind of things that we learn within the first week of training. None of it is complicated, none of it is hard to understand, none of it needs any sort of theoretical background. But the problem is that the people who are most aware of it are the people who don't need it. And I think if we all thought, the world could have 100 ebooks on how to work with interpreters, because it's going to be different in every country, in every situation, there are going to be tweaks. There's a book out that I saw called Translation Getting It Right. Well, there's a version called Interpreting Getting It Right, but I think we need more of that kind of thing that doesn't take a lot of effort. You could be funny, you could be pedantic, however you want to be, but to just make the effort to say something. And I would say on the other side of things, I would like us to have, for one day a year, that all interpreters who are members of an association or part of an institution commit that for one day a year, they will refuse to say anything negative about clients on social media, just for one day a year, and see how it affects how people see our profession.
Agreed in full. And another idea? Anybody, any interpreter with a website should dedicate at least one page to raising awareness, to explaining a little bit of what interpreting is and what we do and how we do it. Instead of just saying, hey, pick me. I've interpreted for Obama, I've interpreted for this and that, showing pictures and this and that. Fine, this is the marketing side of it. Great, you need that. But take advantage of your website also to educate the public.
Very good.
Can I just say that I'm bouncing around like an excited toddler on my chair, because this is exactly the thing that I've been dreaming that people would say, and I think it doesn't take a lot. Not everyone has to write a TED video, not everyone has to go and speak to UN experts, but I love this idea of, one page on your website, one blog post, one poster, just the really, really simple things. And I think all of our complaints about wages, about conditions, they would all disappear if we would all work together to raise awareness, not just for what, I'm a conference interpreter, it's great for me to raise awareness of what I do, but it's even better if I talk to someone who's a medical interpreter and start talking up the amazing things that they do as well, and show people that we're actually, okay, we do different things in different places, but we are one profession, and we're all equally skilled and equally important.
Yeah, and it doesn't take much. And again, as I said, if you don't feel like even writing a page on your own, just, list a bunch of links to other people's stuff out there, to Jonathan's book, to the video out there, to any other sort of resource that does the job for you.
That's excellent. And I think maybe that's a good point to wrap up this discussion. There are at least a few points that I would take away. For example, that in our communication we don't throw around the rules and the manuals and the standards and all that stuff so much, but that we focus more on the customer, on the client, so that we demonstrate the value that we can deliver, and that we then, of course, also deliver that value, that we work for our customers, that we show them what we can do and what the advantage is of working with interpreters. And one point, just one point is communicating well, because that's often portrayed as something, we have to speak properly because the interpreters want us to. No, actually, you have to speak properly because you want to communicate well, because you want your event to be successful, your conference, your meeting, whatever it is. So that's just a key factor to a successful event in and of itself. It's not something that people have to do for the interpreters. And I think if we can get our communication to focus more on that, focus more on the client, I think that's already a big step ahead. So we can look for names like Chris Durbin, who does a lot of that for translation. Then people like Tess Whitty, who does an excellent podcast on marketing, or the work of Marta Stelmasak or Valeria Aliperta on marketing and branding. I think those are all points that we can use and that we can build on, and that we should ideally, as you have said, build on together. I would like to thank, first of all, our guest for today, Ewandro.
My pleasure, as usual.
Thanks for being on the podcast, and maybe we can have you back someday. Thank you as well to Alexander Gansmeyer in Munich. Thank you to Jonathan Downey in Scotland. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the following episodes. And if you have a minute and you've enjoyed listening to us, why not give us a rating or a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts? That would be much appreciated. And I believe you can still vote in the Pros Community Awards. So that's another way of showing your appreciation for our podcast. Thanks for listening, and talk to you next time. Bye-bye. You had a good time there, right, Jonathan?
That was incredible.
Ewandro, I think you really made Jonathan's week by saying what you said.
Yeah.
That's it, I guess.